All right. Hello, students from Paul 203. This is a podcast for the second week of July, 2015 in the summer. And what we're going to do in this part of the podcast is talk about some of the issues that I introduced already in class this week, dealing with Robert Kaiser's book, An Act of Congress. And this is what I want you to do. I want you to go to the Prezi it's called a mapping. I called it mapping out an act of Congress, and I want you to start on, I believe, slide 17, and then follow along with me as I go through some of the issues. Okay, so what I want you to start to think about, and again, this is something I talked about in class already, is this question of how can we understand an act of Congress in light of some other claims, some other general theories about the role of interest groups and public opinion in political science, or rather, the role of interest groups and public opinion in the congressional legislative process. And we also want to address the question of Kaiser's claim that somehow an act of Congress reveals the dysfunctions that disfigure the contemporary Congress. So in terms of public opinion and interest group power in the legislative process, what I want you to be able to do is to use the evidence that's presented in an act of Congress to consider, or to see how use this evidence to explain and to consider some of these theories about how or what determines the political process in the United States, what determines the outcomes of politics, we might say. Okay, so we've talked about these theories. I'll go through them just very quickly. The theory of majoritarian electoral democracy is that the congressional legislative process more or less shifts in accordance with public opinion. The theory of economic elite domination is that a relatively small, you might call it a caste of elites, is able to control the political process in one way or another. Madisonian pluralism is the idea that there is a relative diverse group of interests who are able to affect the political process. There's no one segment of the interest group populace that is able to completely dominate the political system. Over time, the interest groups will balance each other out. You might say that the power of interest groups is in general a reflection of the distribution of opinion or power in society as a whole. So in a sense, the theory of Madisonian pluralism, again, is that the various interest groups will balance each other out in some way. Not on every issue, certainly, but perhaps overall. The theory of biased pluralism is that certain kinds of interest groups are going to have more power than others. So I think that, or what I want you to consider, is that the various ways in which an act of Congress reflects or sheds light on all of these theories. They're all true to some extent. What's good about using act of Congress to consider these theories is that, of course, Kaiser didn't set out to prove or disprove any one of them. He didn't have, I don't think, a clear program. He didn't have a clear point he was trying to get at. He didn't have a theory he was trying to prove. It seems to me the book as a whole tries to just present a narrative about the legislative process. And so as we can see, there's some evidence for all of these different theories about how the political process works. Okay, a second set of issues deals with this question of whether or not the contemporary legislative process in Congress is somehow dysfunctional. Now, why might it be dysfunctional? Well, we can think of this in terms of the different kinds of incentives that can motivate members of Congress. So if you're looking at the Prezi, you see I've represented a member of Congress here, Senator Mike Crapo of Republican Idaho. Must have been a difficult name to grow up with, I imagine. This photo of Senator Crapo is actually a mugshot from when he was arrested for drunk driving. What besides the desire to avoid the police motivates Senator Mike Crapo or any senator or any representative in Congress? Well, there's the incentives of election and re-election, there's the incentive of power within Congress, and there's the incentives of policy. We can understand Kaiser's basic claim to be that politics trumps policy in the contemporary Congress. What this means is that senators like Crapo, not all the time, but often enough, are making decisions based upon their desire either to appeal to the public or based on their desire to achieve power within Congress. How do you achieve power within Congress under contemporary conditions? Well, you achieve power within Congress by satisfying your own party. This is particularly the case for the Republicans, but it's also the case for the Democratic Party as well. If you want to move up within the committee system, if you want to achieve power as a committee chair, power on a committee that you're interested in, you have to support your party. How does this connect with the question of re-election? Party unity within the legislative process, and particularly party unity that aims to defeat the actions, the projects of the government, let's say, of the majority party, has, under contemporary conditions, a greater possibility of leading to electoral victories. So in other words, it's not only the case that ideological polarization is making cooperation and collaboration within Congress more difficult, it's the fact that there is close electoral competition as well. This means that sort of a combative approach to the legislative process is likely to yield greater payoffs. Keep in mind this general question that every party in Congress asks itself, and really every individual member in Congress asks itself all the time. Do we want to act, if we're the minority party, do we want to try to be part of the government? Do we want to collaborate with the majority party, try to have some influence in the electoral process, the legislative process? Or do we want to act as an opposition? Do we want to oppose what the majority is doing in the hopes that this will reshape public opinion, that this will enable us to become the majority? The Constitution, of course, doesn't give any answer to that. The institutions of the Constitution create different kinds of situations where, in some cases, individual members are going to want to cooperate and collaborate. That was the general pattern under the textbook Congress. The contemporary Congress, as Kaiser demonstrates, or as he illustrates, obviously is much more conflictual. There is much more politics plays in the bad sense. Politics plays a role in the policy-making process. Politics in the sense of individual members not simply acting to create the best legislation possible, but individual members acting, with one eye on the electoral arena. So, one thing we should see when considering an act of Congress is that, to some degree, it's easy to exaggerate how far polarization has gone. There are signs not only of polarization, there's signs not only of the politicization of the policy process, but there's also some of the old elements of the textbook Congress as well. It's more difficult, certainly, but there is an element of collaboration and bipartisanship that is particularly evident if we look at the Senate. And that's what we're going to turn to now. Okay. So, moving on to the Prezi, and keeping in mind our goal here, which is to try to relate what we see in an act of Congress to these theories about interest group power and the relative power of interest groups versus public opinion, and the question of dysfunction within Congress, and to what extent do the incentives of members of Congress create an institution that isn't working anymore. Okay, so starting at section 19 of the Prezi, we're turning now to the legislative process within the Senate. First thing to note, and in some ways unsurprising, there's a considerable amount of agreement between the Senate Democratic Party and the House Democratic Party in regards to what needs to be done in terms of financial regulation. We don't need to go through all of this. As we'll soon see, however, perhaps the greatest bone of contention is going to be the Consumer Financial Protection Agency. Keep in mind that this is the idea of a bureaucracy that is going to limit the kinds of financial products that financial institutions can offer, particularly in terms of mortgages and so on and so forth. All right, so moving on to section 20. Unsurprisingly, the Republican Party had objections to the legislative agenda for Dodd-Frank, in particular the Consumer Financial Protection Agency, but also to the notion that there should only be a single regulator for financial institutions at the national level. The book goes into detail as to why this is a problem, basically from the Democratic perspective, and probably this is not just a Democratic perspective, but it makes sense just in general. The problem with having multiple regulators at the federal level is that essentially institutions are able to shop around to find a regulator that is just right. It's a kind of Goldilocks system for federal regulations. That is, if you arrange your affairs in one way, you can shift from the Federal Reserve to another institution and so on. The Democrats in the Senate, however, on this issue of having a single federal financial regulator, this is something that's not only opposed by the Republicans, but it was also seen as essentially a bridge too far by Barney Frank and Obama. Probably not because they disagreed with it in intellectual terms, but simply because they thought the politics of it was too extreme. So I think here again, this gets back to this question of, even if we see that on many issues big finance is losing out, we can still see that, in terms of the theories of elite economic domination, there are political limits, and maybe even limits in terms of the ideas that politicians are willing to entertain. So this is on this question, you find some evidence for the theory of elite economic domination. But keep in mind as well that it's not only big finance that is concerned with the problems of a single regulator. It's that there are constituencies within governments for those separate regulators. The more regulators that are involved, the more members of Congress that are overseeing them across different committees. By splitting up regulation in that way, you're also allowing a broader range of individuals within Congress to have influence over financial regulation. So this is a very complex situation, and like a lot of cases, there are a lot of different motives involved. Okay, so now we turn to section 21 of the Prezi, and here I just want to point out the basic problem that Kaiser is introducing when he's discussing Dodd's introduction of the bill in the Senate Banking Committee. And this has to do with the initial signs of Republican opposition. The basic part of the story, which he goes through in chapter 15, is the fact that Dodd introduces the bill, and right away, Richard Shilby, the ranking member of the Republican Party on the Banking Committee, begins with a harshly critical statement of the Democratic platform. Now, this is interesting because only several weeks later, Richard Shilby gives a speech at Oxford University in which he seems to be much more open to regulatory reform, much more critical of Wall Street and so on. And I think what Kaiser is pointing towards here is this problem of politics versus policy. This is something I discussed in class. The basic idea, the basic claim is that Republicans and Democrats at some level actually have a certain amount of agreement over what needs to be done in terms of financial reform. However, the political imperative is to downplay the area of agreement and to emphasize the scope of disagreement. In other words, there's a political imperative to both scuttle the legislative process, to deal the Democratic Party, the majority party, the government party, a defeat, and as opposed to trying to work together with the Democrats in order to create a stronger bill. So that's Kaiser's basic claim here, which he illustrates in this instance by the two different sides to Richard Shilby, and this is something that is going to come up again and again over the course of the legislative process. All right, moving on to section 22, we can see that even though Shelby and some of the Republican leadership in the Senate have voiced some harsh criticisms of Dodd's plans, voiced some harsh criticisms of the entire process for the Dodd-Frank bill. Again, mostly focusing on the claim, as Kaiser mentions again and again, focusing on the claim that the Democratic bill is going to allow for further government bailouts and so on and so forth. Dodd, nevertheless, has to, or he has a great incentive to, try to have a more collaborative strategy within the Senate. And this is for a simple reason. You cannot be certain that all Democrats are going to be on your side. If you have no Republican support, if the Republican opposition at this stage is completely unified, the potential for a filibuster being able to shut down the legislative process is a very great possibility. What's coming forward in a few months, Dodd couldn't know this initially, is that the Democrats are going to lose their filibuster-proof majority in the Senate after Scott Brown wins Ted Kennedy's former seat in Massachusetts. So Dodd's legislative strategy is to try to find people to work with. So he creates working groups amongst Republicans, most prominently, as we'll see, with Bob Corker. But what also is important here is that Dodd's willingness to focus on collaboration and his willingness to really focus on just achieving a piece of legislation is connected to the fact that he's abandoned his re-election efforts. So this is not only a question of time, like he will be able to spend more time focusing on the legislation, but it's also the case that in working with the Republicans and in crafting his solutions for the bill, he doesn't have to take public opinion into account. And as we'll see later on, electoral incentives affect not only the Republican Party, and it sort of pushes them towards being intransigent opponents of the bill. It's also going to affect how Democrats view the legislative process. Okay, so as I said, the need for collaboration is going to be reinforced as the Dems lose their veto-proof Senate majority. And as Kaiser points out, the GOP opposition is based on a kind of a difficult situation that they're in, which is that the public still has a disdain for Wall Street in the aftermath of the financial crisis. Simply opposing all reform is not going to be plausible. So the Democrats, or rather the Republicans, as informed by their Frank Luntz, the GOP pollster, have to find a way of criticizing the reform project of Dodd-Frank without necessarily endorsing the status quo. Okay, moving on to Section 23. As Kaiser points out, and this is important to see, Dodd is able to establish a close working relationship with Senator Corker of Tennessee, and this is just a good thing to note, which is that polarization as a whole does not eliminate all possibilities for collaboration, and this is in some cases because not all politicians fit into the polarization model. You might think that, you might see that in the case of Corker, he's not someone who is a conservative or member of the conservative movement per se. He will certainly have some conservative inclinations, but essentially he's someone who has not been motivated by ideology in the strict sense. Someone who has more of a business background. Someone who is therefore available as a partner. Now it turns out it's not necessarily going to work out perfectly in the end, but the only thing we should note is that even in an era of polarization, the potential for cooperation has not disappeared entirely. And in the Senate, this is important because it's necessary. All right. I don't want to say too much about the specific details of Dodd's perspective on financial regulation and Corker's perspective. I just want to get you to note several things looking here at Section 24 of the Prezi. Again, one of the most important differences here, and something that we also saw in the House process is that there is in terms of the area of bipartisan agreement, or at least potential bipartisan agreements, there is a concern that institutions that were in no way responsible for the financial crisis are going to be subject to onerous regulatory requirements that are going to affect them adversely. And in the House, we saw how this came about, say, in relation to auto dealers. And what this shows us, and something that Barney Frank talks about as part of Kaiser's book, is this notion that power is not necessarily something that's derived from finances, or rather from money alone. And what matters is the fact that certain kinds of groups form what Frank called, natural grassroots networks. Basically, groups, small institutions that not only they're not seen as villains in the public eye, and more importantly, that they're institutions that are scattered throughout the country, institutions, firms, businesses that have connections with individual legislators. They're able to create a kind of critical mass of support for, restricting the scope of any kind of new financial regulation. So this becomes a potential basis for bipartisan cooperation. Something else that's interesting to note, and this is not so much connected with the main themes I'm talking about now, the themes about motivation of individual members or interest group power, is the question of how they're trying to structure the Consumer Financial Protection Administration, or the Consumer Financial Protection Board. Now consider this. Dodd's goal is to create a regulatory organization that, even though it's going to be nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate, and that's just normal, the members are appointed in a fairly normal way. What's interesting is that Dodd wants to create an institution that will not be directly controlled by Congress. In particular, he wants the CFPA to have an independent source of funding, and they'll mess around with different kinds of ways in which this board can have independent funding. Now that's interesting and important, particularly when we come to talk about the presidency, because what's strange here is that Dodd is not trying to protect the institutional prerogatives of Congress. What he's trying to do is to create a policy that will not respond to changes in public opinion, because he wants an institution that will essentially be able to act on its own. If you take away the authorization, or rather the appropriations power of Congress, that is the power of Congress to decide we're only going to give this institution money for these sets of things, we're only giving them this sorts of money, then really you have a kind of autonomous bureaucracy that is able to act without any concern with the wishes of Congress or with the concerns of public opinion. It's interesting that a member of Congress wants to create an institution that is independent of Congress. Kaiser doesn't point this out as an example of partisan dysfunction, but in some ways it is. It's basically Dodd saying, I don't want future administrations to have too much control over this board. I don't want future members of Congress to have too much control over this board. If they're going to control it, they have to mobilize the entire legislative process to create new laws, and not simply use the authorization process. So I think that is particularly interesting. And of course, it's connected to this notion that there's something desirable about having experts who are not too beholden to the elected branches. The idea is that once this board is established, it's going to operate more or less on autopilot. It's going to have the power to create new rules, the power really to create law, with no real direct way for Congress to control it. All right, moving along to Section 25 and Section 26. What basically happens in this part of the narrative is that as Corker starts working with Dodd, and as well as some other Senate Republicans on the Banking Committee, to basically find or rather create a bill that is going to gain some serious Republican support, a bill that is going to be genuinely bipartisan. Richard Shelby of the Banking Committee, probably influenced by Republican leadership, is basically starting to back away. Back away from supporting Corker, not only out of perhaps some kind of personal animosity or personal jealousy, but more importantly, because of the broader political context. And I think what Kaiser wants us to see here is that even though on an individual ideological level, there might be some members of the Republican Party, sort of outliers like Corker, who are willing to compromise, who aren't thinking in purely political terms, it is nevertheless the case that the Republican Party as a whole, oriented more towards the electoral environment, see a successful bipartisan bill as something that's going to benefit the Democratic Party far more than the Republican Party. So basically what's happening at this stage, moving along to Section 26, is that Corker is no longer able to guarantee much support from the GOP. Dodd scuttles the agreement that they had been working on and moves forward to promote a bill that is going to be different in significant ways, a bill that is going to, in essence, instead of trying to get more Republican support, now Dodd has to worry about, or he has to make the attempt to ensure that he's going to have complete Democratic support, which means that he's going to have to defer more to the left wing of the Democratic Party. If you're losing any chance of having any kind of broad Republican support by collaborating with them, you have to make sure that you end up with all members of your own party. So the bill that's introduced by March 15th in the Senate is essentially one that has broader powers for the Consumer Financial Protection Board. It has the Resolution Authority Fund, which is going to be controversial for some good reasons, some bad reasons. This is basically money that's assessed by large financial firms, which is then available more or less to help failing firms go out of business. Republicans are going to refer to this as a bailout fund. That's not exactly correct. Perhaps most importantly, in this new version of the bill, Dodd is going to introduce a version of the Volcker rule, named after former Fed Chairman Paul Volcker. And all we need to know about this is that the banks don't like it. This is basically a rule that's going to make it more difficult for banks to invest their own capital. And the basically idea is that this make it more difficult for the banks to have windfall profits, but it's going to make them less likely to get into real trouble. So the bill, basically as a consequence of withdrawing from the negotiation process, the Republican Party is going to risk having a bill that affects banks more adversely. And I think one way to consider this is that it's a sign, in a way, of the weakness of big finance in comparison with the electoral concerns of the Republican Party. Think about it from the perspective of the large financial institutions. They would much rather have a bill that the Republicans have worked with the Democrats on that doesn't impose these kinds of harsh conditions. Essentially, the Republican Party, by saying we're not going to cooperate on this, is taking a real risk, because what they're saying is that they're saying that if the Democratic Party passes this bill, it's going to be far more rigorous than anything that would have emerged. What big finance would prefer, of course, is Republican collaboration. Certainly, they have to accept some additional forms of regulation, but they'd probably be able to avoid some of the worst things. So, in a way, the unwillingness of the Republican Party to collaborate is a sign of the power of electoral concerns as opposed to the power of interest groups. All right, now we're moving on to Section 27 and the movement into the Senate markup and amendment process, sort of the final stage. And the one thing to note here is the simple fact that deliberation more or less breaks down at this stage of the legislative process. What essentially happens is that the Republicans withdraw. Really, they stop any kind of attempt to introduce amendments that would make the bill more appealing to the Republican Party. There's essentially very little deliberation only a nominal markup, formal markup process. The idea here again is that the Republican Party is washing its hands of the entire process, and they're taking a partisan stand. So once again, from Kaiser's perspective, this is the sign of how politics, electoral concerns are trumping concerns with policy. So after this process, Dodd hasn't given up on trying to cooperate with moderate GOP senators, though it looks as if it's going to be very difficult to get any Republican support. The Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell is basically mobilizing GOP opposition. They're basically treating this as an opportunity for strategizing, looking forward to the upcoming election. What's also happening, though, and this is something Kaiser refers to as, the context, the mysterious context that's always affecting everything that's happening within the Senate, is that on the one hand, the Democrats have been able to pass Obamacare, and there's been a report on the financial crisis, which that has come from the Senate, that has been particularly damning of Wall Street, particularly damning of the decisions by former administrations not to try to rein in the risk-taking of Wall Street. So the basic idea here is that it seems as if a go-it-alone strategy on for the Democrats, a strategy that in some ways they didn't choose themselves, has a greater chance of being successful. The problem for the Democrats is that they no longer have a veto-proof majority, and moving forward to Section 29, we see the problem that occurs. In the absence of a veto-proof majority, and in the absence of having 60 votes, they literally can't move forward on the process for dealing and proceeding with the bill. So this is another sign of Senate dysfunction. The idea here is that the filibuster, the 60-vote requirement, is not used in extraordinary situations only. It's part of the routine process of the Senate. Instead of being used only in completely extreme circumstances, on issue after issue, the 60-vote requirement is invoked, essentially to scuttle the legislative process. So the filibuster has become simply a entrenched supermajoritarian requirement. The problem, of course, is that parties are not, disciplined armies in the American context. Discipline is weak. And what happens here that allows the process to continue is that other changes in the context, in this case, the Goldman Sachs hearings, which draw a fair amount of public attention. These Senate hearings, basically weaken the resolve of some Republicans to filibuster the Dodd-Frank bill. So they're able to go ahead with the legislative process. Okay, so what's also happening at this stage in the process is that there are continuing negotiations over the so-called derivatives problem. And here we can move forward to Section 30 on the Prezi. Now, I talked a bit about my lack of understanding of derivatives in class. All we need to know is they're the financial products that are assumed to be, supposedly people know that these are the causes of, or were part of the cause of the financial crisis. They have to be constrained in some way because they basically enable excessive risk taking. And so one thing to think about here, and this is something that's discussed in Chapter 20, entitled Staff Warfare, is this question of what happens when you try to engage in a regulatory project, in a legislative project, when you have senators and members of Congress who understand, derivatives about as well as I do, as people with relatively minimal amount of information. You would imagine that this could be a situation or a circumstance where interest group power could be most significant. Why? The decisions that are going to be made about derivatives are in some part going to be determined by staffers. In fact, to a large part, the members of Congress have to rely upon their staffers. And the general idea is that staffers have incentives in the same way that members of Congress do. In fact, perhaps the idea is that staffers have even greater incentive to defer to interest groups precisely because they hope to maintain the goodwill of that industry, they hope to have positions in the future within that industry, and so on and so forth. What we see in terms of the Senate Banking Committee staffers is that they're not lobbied only by members of the financial community, or rather the financial community includes not only the private institutions, but also essentially an international regulatory community with its own ideas about how to regulate derivatives. So I just want you to draw your attention to this as an example of the complexity of lobbying and the complexity of interest group power that's demonstrated in an act of Congress. By considering the story of Ms. Julie Chan in Chapter 20, she's the Senate Banking Committee staffer responsible for derivatives. And here we can see that it's not just material incentives that matter for Ms. Chan. Clearly, she's motivated by ideas. She's motivated by a kind of sense of professional responsibility. So even when you're talking about staffers who don't have to have as much concern for public opinion, we can see that interest group power ends up being balanced out because there's different kinds of power. There's not only financial pressure, there's not only lobbying pressure, there's the power of ideas, the power of professional standards. Okay, but here's the other problem. Kaiser has spent a good part of this section of the book talking about the ways in which the electoral incentives of the Republican Party distorts the policymaking process because the Republicans have a disincentive to cooperate and collaborate on making the policy process work. What also happens, of course, is that there are members of the Democratic Party who have their own electoral incentives that's going to distort the policy process in its own way. For reasons that the book explains at length, it's not only the Senate Banking Committee that has jurisdiction over the derivatives issue. The Senate Agricultural Committee has jurisdiction over derivatives as well. The basic reason is that agriculture uses derivatives as well for a variety of reasons that we don't really need to get into. Now, the key problem for the Democratic Party is that Senator Blanche Lincoln, a Democrat of Arkansas, is being lobbied by two sides. On the one hand, she's being lobbied by big finance who want to have as much flexibility as they can in regards to derivatives. But Senator Lincoln is also facing a primary threat from the left in Arkansas. Who wins out in this battle? Well, it's a little bit complicated, but essentially what happens is that Lincoln wants to take a tack to the left and try to impose even stricter financial regulations in regards to derivatives. Essentially, she argues that banks must separate from their derivative trading operations. The Obama administration thinks this is a problem, mostly for technical reasons, in the sense that they don't think it's going to work in terms of constraining the financial industry as a whole. But the reason Lincoln is doing it is that it appears as if this is taking a strong stand against the banks. So you have a very complex situation where what appears to be something that's going to harm the financial industry is in fact something that might enable it or provide opportunities for even more risk-taking in the future. Other Senate Democrats are on board with this, so it's creating a difficult situation now for the party, but it might be necessary to essentially keep the Democratic Party in the Senate together, as something which is becoming more important as the Republicans seem to have abandoned any hope of compromise. All right, so this is as far as I want to go now in terms of what I want to cover in an act of Congress. Let me just point out a few major issues from the sections that I have covered. In terms of the dysfunctional aspect of Congress, what the section on the Senate demonstrates most clearly is that yes, electoral concerns are really constraining the kinds of collaboration that can happen within the Senate, within Congress as a whole. The idea here is that parties have an incentive to force a loss upon the other party, even if there's a considerable degree of ideological overlap on some of these aspects of regulation. Not all of them, certainly, but at least some aspects of them. But what we should also see is that this is something, the electoral influence is something that affects both parties as well, as we see in the case of Blanche Lincoln. The electoral process that causes the Republicans to be intransigent is also going to cause Democrats in many instances to be responsive to outside groups, outside social movements, and so on and so forth. But, you can't separate the disadvantages of a concern with electoral fortunes from the advantages. And what we can also see is that, at least in some ways, part of the reason that large interest groups, the most well-financed interest groups, aren't able to get their way in the legislative process is precisely because the parties, whether it's the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, are so attentive to other electoral forces. Okay, so I'm going to return to active Congress when we're back in class, but hopefully this has given you some ideas about some of the major themes to be considering. When we're back in class in a few weeks, we'll look at the final outcome, the conference committee, and try to have a final assessment of what active Congress can tell us about both the power of interest groups and public opinion in the legislative process and the question of whether the politicization of Congress makes it dysfunctional.